Made possible through support from ARC Thrift Stores, Colorado District Attorney's Council, Developmental Pathways, and the ARC of Aurora. A THINK+change training.
Hello and welcome back to THINK+change and the ARC of Aurora's upcoming series on rights as it relates to people with IDD. This is our second episode in the VOD series. And the first one, we talked a little bit about what are rights? This one, we're going to dive into final settings and how that might support. But I would be remiss if I did not introduce the fabulous team with me. We've got Jeffrey Fernangel, super cool with his shades on, Tom Walsh, Anna Cafaro, as well as Petrie Brill. These fine folks make up the advocacy team at the ARC of Aurora, but I'm grateful that you're coming and supporting the THINK+change product to help the community better understand what rights look like as an adult or person with an intellectual or developmental disability. So, well, we talked all about kind of the basic general rights. I wanted to focus this episode more on what is called the final settings rule. And I would suspect if you're a professional tuning in, you've heard this term before, but perhaps aren't really sure how it can be implemented in your daily work or in the service that you provide. As a family member or individual with a disability, you might have also heard about it, but because it was developed by the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services, so the federal kind of arm of Medicaid, in 2014, people have been tossing around this language around final settings rule for many, many years, but because it's never really fully rolled out, I would suspect folks don't really know what the heck it means. So I wanted to spend some time today with our crew talking about what final settings rule is, essentially because we're getting much closer to implementation.
Yeah.
So while in 2000, what's that?
Oh, no, I was just saying the grace period is running out.
Finally. So in 2014, they rolled out these expectations of service providers who are using HCBS monies. And this is not just specific to the developmental disability waiver in Colorado. It's across the nation and any HCBS waivers that are being provided, right? So they said in 2014, you got 5 years to figure it out. Well, clearly we are past that 5-year mark and it continues to be extended. Right now, the current implementation date that all services should be prepared to roll with is March of 2023. So we know in Colorado, we're inching closer and closer towards it, right? And really what these final settings did was they helped to really reimagine or redevelop expectations for community-based settings. You know, if you're familiar, for many a decade, people with intellectual and developmental disabilities have been fighting for their right to live in community settings, right? To be what we call deinstitutionalized, where, you know, perhaps in the 1950s, parents who had kiddos with disabilities expected that child with a disability to live in an institution and perhaps no longer live in that community setting. Well, as we've inched closer to the day, 2021, we really wanted to, as a community and as service providers, kind of realize what deinstitutionalization can be, right? It's no longer living in a community setting that feels pretty much like an institution. It's just much smaller, or it's down the road, right? And so the final settings rule certainly help us as advocates talk more about choice and community integration and really what the intention was behind the ADA as well as the deinstitutionalization push, right? So this final settings, it's an odd title because it doesn't help a lot of us to understand, but what we know from the final settings rule is that it helps define what those settings should look like. And within those settings, how services shall be rendered or provided, right? So it really optimizes individuality, personal choice, gets rid of what they called enclaves or work environments that were not integrated with the community. It was just, a bunch of people with disabilities working over there, away from their typical peers, right? It helps to develop some really great language around tenant rights if an individual is living outside of their family home. It does a lot of really cool things. And so let's talk and dive kind of into what those pieces look like. But I mentioned personal choice, and I'm wondering, Anna, if you've got a bit more information, because we often hear the word choice and person-centeredness in the disability world, but I'm not sure it's implemented the same way across environments. So tell us what we should know.
Yeah, well, it's funny because as I was preparing for today's webinar, I found a statistic that says we make over 35,000 choices a day.
Wow.
From little things on switching on a light or what I'm going to have for breakfast to big things like who am I going to hang out with tonight, or what job am I going to apply for? And basically what we need to remember, and I think this is the good thing about this final settings, is that the philosophy behind it is that the freedom to choose is one of those human rights we talked about in our first, and that we have the right to choose how we spend our money, how we make decisions about our health care, where we want to live, who we want to live with, and these are all rights we have that should be protected. And everyone says that having the ability to make these choices, and I think we can all identify with this, is what gives our life value and meaning. Yeah. And, the more independent we can be, the more in charge we can be of our life, the more successful we feel. And so giving everyone, and especially, our community, our disability community, the right to make those choices is something that we should honor. And unless there's a really good reason, as you guys were talking about before, to remove the right to make that choice, then that choice should be a person's choice.
Totally. And I think we see oftentimes, because choice is so individualized, or should be individualized, right? That oftentimes we run in teams or with people, or even in our personal life, where, the choice someone else is making is not the one perhaps I would. And I think that continues and will always be a balance, especially when you're receiving services, with allowing people to make choices that might not be the best choices, or you might have your own personal experience that makes you feel uncomfortable with that person's choice, right? But really always finding that balance of how we can help people realize choice and not artificially build in choices that, are not real choice, right? It's not real choice whether you want this banana whole or this banana cut up, right? You're still getting a banana. And so kind of looking to it, ways we can build additional real life choices and experiences. But Anna, you mentioned, that rights modification, that we don't always have the right to do all the things we might want to do. And certainly when you're receiving services, that might look a little different. Petrie, will you tell us a little bit about what kind of that rights modification looks like and why a team or an individual might consider it?
It's a lot of it is around safety for self or safety of others in the community. And often that's kind of the first knee-jerk reaction of a team, being concerned about some sort of behavior or some sort of action that the individual is taking. So while that is, definitely a concern, you always want to make sure that you're kind of weighing the options between health and safety, as opposed to the team just being really nervous about what can sometimes potentially be harmful behavior to themselves, but also kind of ties in with dignity of risk and choice. And Tom will talk about that a little bit more, I think, later down the line. But so just, always wanting to make sure that it does truly fall on the side of actual harm to an individual or themselves. Excuse me, or someone in the community.
Someone else, yeah.
Yeah, someone else.
What if, we talked at the first episode about the concept of informed consent, and that a person receiving services has to agree essentially to a rights modification. what happens if a person does not agree?
Well, first of all, informed consent really does, there are several facets to that. One of them, there has to be a description and a specific time period. And that is part of the informed consent, that this individual has to have the understanding of what the behavior is and how long this rights modification will last for.
Mm-hmm.
As we mentioned in our first episode, it can't just be indefinite. There has to be a timeline around it. The individual also has to know the reason for the rights modification. And this is also really important too. The team needs to demonstrate that all kinds of other supports and interventions have been tried before and have not worked. And that's kind of a key piece that I think people forget. They just kind of get nervous and say, oh, a rights modification before trying other interventions and supports. And so I just kind of wanted to highlight that too, because that's really important.
For sure.
So when we come down to not, so perhaps the individual does not consent to this, which they have every right to not consent to it, then it's also informed consent that the team shares with them. Okay, that's your right. Here are some possible things that may happen due to your behavior. Consequences, whatever that is, they need to be aware that, okay, if you want to go meet someone off the internet that you've not met before in the park, have the right to do that. But here are some possible things that can happen because of your behavior. And so we want to really make them aware too, so that then they can start building the skills and the tools to then make the choice to either do it or, oh, well, that doesn't necessarily sound so great after all. And then they, can start building skills around just being more discriminate in their choice making and really using discretion and kind of some, weighing the pros and cons of what they're about to embark in.
Yeah. Well, and I know, the denial of signature for an informed consent, which then leads to the inability for a service provider to really implement it, requires creativity. We get it. From an advocacy perspective, we totally understand that there are health and safety things that really could benefit an individual in a specific setting. But we also know that it's not a one size fit all, right? And writing a behavior plan that worked for, person A is not always going to work for person B. And so being creative and relooking at what environment these things are happening in, is there a way that we can as a team tweak that? And then are there other ways to look at that behavior in terms of, what is this behavior serving? How does this serve that person, right? The example you use, Petrie, around meeting people off the internet is actually pretty typical, right? How many people do we know in our personal lives who actually have relationships that budded from an internet or, an online interaction? And so there's ways in which we can, as a community, support people to access these typical opportunities, but to provide the background and foundation of support that helps folks be more successful at those, right? We've also heard that service providers, that might be concerned that if they can't do whatever rights modification, that they're not real sure that they can keep people safe. And I think it's reasonable to consider, on the spectrum of what rights modifications could and should be used for, that perhaps if an individual is not willing to, have a sharps restriction because there is legitimate concerns around health and safety for that individual or other people in the house, that a service provider also has the right to say, well, then we just can't serve you. If I can't keep you or my household safe in this way, then we just can't serve you. So it's a double, both sides of the coin there, right? Yes, well, we can be more flexible, but also some providers just aren't willing to maybe take that risk with you.
And that's, an unintended consequence that, they may incur. And I think it's important to remember too, Hani, as you were talking, it just kind of occurs to me that, you talk about the creativity piece, and while it sounds kind of counterintuitive when you hear the phrase rights modification. It still needs to be person-centered.
Mhm.
And that's a really important piece to remember. It really needs to be tailored and individualized to this human that, you know, needs support, and not just a generic, all-encompassing, overreaching modification. So that's, I think, important to keep in mind.
Absolutely. Well, like Anna was talking about earlier, you know, you get to choose and elect your services and the support you receive.
That's right.
And so while the informed consent might not make sense for you, it could look totally different in another service provider or even another part of the state, right? And so that is true, real, meaningful choice, is when you get to also choose, you know, the both sides of it. You get to choose to make progress, or you get to choose to leave a service provider yourself if you don't like the way in which they're considering rights modification or supporting you. Cool. I know another one. So rights modification is a huge topic when it comes to final settings role, but so are tenant rights, which is kind of wacky, right? Because if any of us are living in a home out or in an environment outside of our family home as adults, you know, we've all either have tenant rights when we were, you know, renting or leasing, or we own or are able to manage our own home so that we build in our own rules. So the fact that tenant rights is kind of blowing the minds of people in the service world, I thought it was probably pretty important for us to talk a little bit about what that does, how it changes things, and things people should expect. And I know, Jeff, you were doing some research into it, so tell us what you learned.
Yeah, I'll glaze over the tenant rights, but real quick, I want to start off with the statement that a tenant, whether you have a disability or not, has the same rights as everybody else in the household, flat out. And whether it's an apartment or a host home, there's got to be a lease, and the individual must sign the lease and agree to the specific provisions inside the lease. Now, leases might look different because my lease looks different than Petrie's lease does Tom's lease, but it all should have the same basic rights of a tenant included. One of those flat out simple, you should have a key to your home. It doesn't matter if the host home provider says I'm always there, or, you know, I don't want things taken from my house. That client has the right to a key to get into the building that they live in. And that's something common I've come across plenty of times. And it's a pretty quick argument. Look in the, you know, final settings rule, you know, it's right there. And it should be in the lease. And if it's not in the lease, there can't be anything in the lease that says that you don't have a key. So anytime you sign a lease, read the thing. And if you need support, find someone that can help you support throughout that. Privacy is a basic right. And everybody, you should have your own bedroom. If you're in this waiver system, you have your own bedroom. You don't have to share a bedroom. There shouldn't be a corner of the house with like a curtain around it. Like, you have your own bedroom with a door that closes. Okay. That's just another basic thing. Decorations. Now that's something I care about a lot. If you're in a host home or your own apartment setting and you want to paint the walls purple, well, paint them purple. Now, the host home provider doesn't have to give you the purple paint to paint them. You might have to get that on your own, but you have the right to paint those walls purple. If you like Sasquatches, you could have a giant Sasquatch at the door of your room if that's what you want. Okay. Everybody has the right to decorate their own room. Okay. And don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Another one, basic access. You must be able to access every part of the house. You can't be in a situation where you're in a host home and they're like, well, you can't go into the kitchen after midnight. That would be a rights modification. There'd have to be a reason that you couldn't go in that kitchen. And that's another thing completely. But you have access to a bathroom, you have access to the kitchen, you have access to the living room. The family can't say, well, you have your room and this is our living room, please don't. No, if you want to watch a movie in that living room, go watch a movie in that living room. You're part of the household. People like to talk about roommates. Like, if you have your own apartment, just because you're in services doesn't mean you don't get to pay. If you have a roommate, a friend, cousin or someone you like that you want to live with, you have that right. There's not something saying, oh, you're on a waiver and so we're going to pick your roommate for you. No, if you can find a roommate, and you like that person, go ahead and live with them. And then visitors is another one. You have the right to have guests, whether you're in a host home or an apartment. Now, if those visitors are unsafe for you or a housemate, there needs to be a discussion about that visitor and some rules maybe put in place. But, you can't just not be allowed to have visitors because you're in a host home and it's not your house. Because once again, you're part of the house. So if they can have visitors, why can't you? Now, overnight visitors, you're allowed to have that too. But it's got to be within reason. You can't just have someone live in your house with you for free, through, well, it's a host home, but I have a visitor every night. No, there's some rules about that. That's like in a nutshell, the main things that I would like to point out. There's a lot of other nuances and whatnot, but those are like the main issues I come across with tenant rights.
Totally. Well, and as you were talking about, all of the rights, we know that along with your rights come responsibilities, right? And so while I should have the right to paint my room whatever color I want, it's still a conversation worth having with your roommates, right? And your roommates could both be people in services as well as the folks that are hosting you in that home-like environment, right? And so dialogue is important because visitors don't make sense for everyone at all times of the night. Getting access to a key certainly makes sense, but you also want to make sure that we're affording the same people in the home their rights as well. They also have a right to privacy. So walking into people's room in the middle of the night isn't super cool for most people you're going to live with, right? And so I think always finding that balance, and that's really what the final settings rule does, is it builds that balance back in, right? The lease allows for, a kind of 15 days for you to have to transition if that home no longer works for you. So we're just not plucking people out of environments, packing bags and, trash bags and kicking them to the curb and finding another location. It's really about honoring and considering the individual's rights as they kind of look at different places to receive services. We've danced around the subject of dignity of risk. And while dignity of risk is still probably kind of a new term and is always worth us reviewing again, Tom, how does dignity of risk kind of play into final settings and receiving services for folks with IDD?
Yeah, so dignity of risk is kind of newer. It's been around academically for a while, but what it really means is any person has a right to make their own choices and decisions, even when those decisions could put them in harm's way. Yeah. So a lot of the individuals we work with kind of feel like they've given up their right to make decisions because a lot of the people in their lives, and that could be doctors, providers, even family members, will try and prevent them from making choices that they feel are risky. But the thing with that is, as humans, we all have the right to fail. Going back to those human rights we talked about in episode 1, making mistakes and learning from those is one of the best ways we can grow as humans. So dignity of risk is the basic human right that allows that process to happen. It's important to have systems in place to limit risk, but not to the point of restricting a person's right to make decisions for themselves. So instead of always avoiding risk, caregivers and team members should really think about how they could support someone to do what they wanted to do safely. The caregiver's duty to give those in their care as much knowledge and support as possible about their rights, abilities, and opportunities. And an example I could think of for this would be, say there's an individual that really wants to use public transportation to get around their city. Members on their team feel that they're not capable of doing that in a safe way. So they decide, well, we're just going to drive you everywhere. Instead, what they should really be doing is, how can we educate this individual to get them to the place where they can successfully utilize that public transportation?
Totally. Well, and go ahead, Jeff.
Guys, I was just thinking about it while Tom was talking. The biggest opportunities I've had to learn in my life have been by making mistakes. So why would we take that away from individuals and services?
Totally. Well, and then there's that whole other side of the spectrum with dignity of risk where, you often hear people say, well, we're being person-centered and, we're not going to take their rights away. When really, the reason people receive services in the IDD world and through HCBS waivers is because they need support. And certainly for folks with IDD, it tells us that they likely have a cognitive disability, which requires the service world to provide support. So you've got dignity of risk on one end where it's like, hey, we all as humans need to be able to fail to learn. And then the other side where, probably out of provider convenience, it's like, well, they've got the choice. They have the right to run into the middle of the highway. What am I going to do? And that's a term coined, that's called hypernormalization.
Yeah.
Tom, do you know anything more about that? Because really what we want to do is make sure people aren't setting folks up for unsafe and harmful environments, providing support, but often that support looks like, from afar, I'm there, I'm going to help you if you need it. I'm certainly not going to let you run into the middle of the highway, or I'm not going to let you engage in behavior that we know could lead, to major health and safety risks.
Yeah, I was thinking about, the best way to talk about this. And I think, honestly, like pragmatism might be the right way to look at it. We have to live in the real world, right? So there are certain individuals that do have an intellectual or developmental disability that will prevent them from engaging in certain things safely.
Yeah.
Hypernormalization is when providers, kind of like you said, Hani, a lot of the time, unfortunately, it's maybe they want to be more hands-off. Maybe they want to just kind of live and let live. And that's when they'll allow an individual to engage in risky behaviors above and beyond what is normal. An instance I could think of is one disability is Prader-Willi.
Yeah.
And that's it affects people to where, they cannot control their own hunger. Their brain will tell them that they're constantly hungry.
Mm-hmm.
And individuals that are dealing with that could literally eat themselves to death.
Yeah.
Hypernormalization would be, well, they said they wanted KFC every night for dinner this week, 3 times a day, maybe even. But we know, and medical providers know, that that's not the right way to support them. Mm-hmm. So it's really just ensuring, kind of going back to that person-centered piece as well, it's individualized. Mm-hmm. So make sure that the team understands that each individual has different needs. And while we want to respect everybody's rights, we also want to live in the real world and ensure that they're really not going to hurt themselves or others.
Totally. And usually when we see that kind of the concept of hypernormalization, it's when we're responding in a way where we're trying to offer choice, but failing to recognize the potential harms. And I totally appreciate listeners and viewers. It feels like a double concept, right? Because we're both saying, go ahead, it's okay to fail. But we're also saying, but recognize the way in which we have come to this person's life through services and supports funded by Medicaid. And our essential job is to keep people healthy and safe. Our job is not to impede the ability for them to, run into mistakes, but we want to make sure we're continuing to keep people's, benefit and health in mind. So I suggest, and I don't know if you all have any ideas too, that if ever you don't know as a service provider or as a family member, or even an individual in services, bring it to your team, bring it to an advocacy organization. Let's talk it through. There is no checkbox. There's no perfect science to this. It's really about what makes sense. How can we support people in accessing and realizing the goals that they have for themselves? Any other little tidbits or nuggets of info that we can share?
I think that leads us into person-centered planning, which you guys have mentioned a little bit. And I feel like it's a mechanism that we have to kind of balance giving choice, protecting, keeping people safe. And I think it helps us think about the individual. And as the title says, person-centered planning, where that person's needs and ideas and thoughts about how they want to live their life and the choices, again, going back to the choices we were talking about, that we're thinking of that in terms of that person, what's best for that person. And sometimes we may have to make some adjustments because of health reasons, as you were saying, Tom, or safety reasons, as we were talking about the bus. And sometimes also the people that are around and love, our person may make some decisions that will influence. But if we think from keeping that person in the middle of our thoughts, focusing on what that person says they want or need to live and what's important to them, and keeping them, safe, then we can use this person-centered planning as a way to make these decisions or balance some of these decisions that, get a little murky, as you guys were saying before.
Totally. It's a good visual too, Anna.
Yeah.
If we are as a team talking about concepts that don't center the person with the disability, then we've probably gotten a little further away. So I in my mind, I'm looking at a picture and the person with a disability is right in the middle of it, and that all of our decision making should come through that person with a disability, what's important to them and what's important for them.
Exactly. And then how we can help them achieve those goals, even if for the moment they might seem unattainable or a little risky.
Totally. Well, viewers and listeners, thank you for tuning in once again. Be sure to pop back over to the next episode where I will interview an expert in the field, really focusing on human rights, what that means for people with IDD, and get just a different perspective. But we appreciate your time. Advocacy team of the Arc of Aurora appreciate your time as well. So we'll see y'all soon.
Thank you.
THINK+change. Talks, trainings, and tools to help in your work for or with people with intellectual and other developmental disabilities. Learn more at www.thinkchange.training.